And so I have a prototype of resource actually that is using async iterable under the hood instead of promise to be able to get multiple values back.
So we're working very closely with the community around this kind of stuff. But I think the biggest opportunity for discussion that I see about how this is going to integrate with large applications today is the ref counted producer thing. Like I understand there's like the share, I don't know, operator or pipe or something in RxJS land that helps you turn an observable that would ordinarily be cold, in the sense that every time you subscribe to it, it does the new thing and has side effects. And it allows you to basically share that among multiple consumers. And it sounds like what we're aiming for in the platform design is basically share built in. I'm getting a nod from Lars, so it sounds like I'm on the right track, maybe a little bit. And so I don't know if the easiest way to prepare for that integration is to just slap share everywhere in your application, make sure it works, and then it'll be a smooth transition to the native API, or that's something to think about. I don't have a lot of large Angular app experience. So I don't know exactly how these things look, but that's my mental framing of it so far.
Lars does, and he's a big RxJS fan. We have a bunch of Angular architects in here who have lots of experience on the ground. So we could start with Lars if you want after, but I want to hear from the Angular team as well and kind of get their feedback. And I'm curious like how this is going to change what they're doing on their end and questions.
Yeah, that'd be great to hear as well.
What do you think, Alex and Pavel?
So maybe I will just like start with maybe some reassurance, right? Like in the sense that like we are kind of asking questions about the unicast versus multicast, because I think we will get into like hot versus cold. I think there is some nuance here, but at least I think I know of two frameworks that kind of did a RxJS alternative, right? Like one is Cycle.js, which kind of so like, okay, I want something different, like different from the like observable type of thing. And second is felt stores, and they both went with the multicast approach and some form of laziness. And so like with maybe a little twist where it's kind of fun because we're starting to discuss it, at least in terms of like spelled stores that for me are like very close to what you're proposing, minus operators. Those stores had kind of access to the information that there is a subscriber or not, so they could like kind of start work where the first subscriber was coming in and like do something when the last was leaving.
Yeah.
Okay.
There's an interesting kind of. First of all, like I think like we could probably talk about this for several hours, so we don't want to like dominate the whole discussion.
I won't stop you. It's allowed here.
We have to have dinner at some point. Yeah. So as far as we're concerned, I think like this is actually kind of a direction that we would very much welcome, as far as having a primitive on the web that is like useful to not just Angular but other framework authors. Some kind of built-in mechanism for representing events in kind of a lazy way, with kind of a fluent API for composition. That's attractive to us for a few reasons, not least of which is we kind of are trying to wean Angular core at least off of RxJS, both because we don't want it to be a part of like you have to learn Rx before you learn Angular. But also because just we want it to be an optional dependency for tree shaking purposes, right? If you don't want to use it, you shouldn't have to pay the cost of Angular kind of having it in internals. So cases where we can either, inside the framework make use of this primitive, or have a type that we could expose to users that is implemented by the browser and not by a library is quite nice. I second the like HTTP client returning an observable that creates, a new request every time is a foot gun that a lot of developers do encounter. I've seen the applications with like 5, parallel requests of the same thing because they have 5 async pipes somewhere in the application.
Or kind of more generally, the act of subscribing being side effectful was one of the arguments that we were kind of bringing to the table when saying like, okay, why we prepare signals for the state management, right? Like this is like the act of observing value shouldn't be consequential, right? Like so.
Yeah. It's a very interesting proposition, though, for like a few reasons. One question I had, I guess, is like the way the retry operations work. They kind of rely on being able to resubscribe to the parent to trigger a new HTTP operation.
Mm-hmm.
And I wonder if, like, what that pattern looks like with kind of multicast observables, because you don't have that same capability of telling your, accessing again the logic that made the request without kind of bringing the ref count down to 0.
The retry is, yeah, I did not think about that so far, and that is, I feel like I can imagine how to work around that, but it's like it's not as obvious. Yeah, it's not just it's literally just resubscribing. Like you have to do some more work or create a new observable that identical to the original, and then subscribe to that or something.
Or you are the owner of the original, right? And then like you can guarantee that no one else is accessing it, and so that your subscription is the only one.
Right.
The kind of second comment, I guess, and a lot of this is like stream of consciousness. We talk with signals a lot about kind of the difference between state and events. State being kind of independent of time. You have, your application is in some state at any given moment. All of your signals will have a value. You do some mutations, those signals have new values. Your application's in a new state, whereas events have some concept of not just like what happened, but like when it happened.
Mm-hmm.
Do something until something else, or debounce with time and things like that. And RxJS kind of always had one foot in both worlds. It was used for event propagation, that has from event operator, and like, the patterns you were showing were exactly the patterns that kind of show up in the RxJS docs. But it also had this foot in the world of state with things like behavior subject, and people using it for kind of state management stores where subscribing kind of immediately gave you the current value for synchronous, state systems.
Mm-hmm.
And as far as I understand it, that is not really a capability that transfers to the API as designed for standardization, because it is kind of more on the event side, so that you don't have behavior subject in a multiplexed observable world. Kind of the first person who subscribes gets the value, but additional subscribers would not like get a current value anymore. And that's an interesting proposition as well.
Okay, get a current value as in like the last value that was emitted.
The last emitted.
So that's a good point. We've talked about this as well, where can we introduce like a buffer operator or something that gives you an observable that buffers n of the most recent values, so that new subscribers can get those right away. And I think we'd probably have to handle that by like in the observable constructor. I think we've talked about this a bit with Ben, where the observable knows like itself. We teach it to buffer some values right up front, so that we could give subsequent subscribers
or if
state.
If the signals proposal goes forward, right, then you have like an observable and a signal, or somehow like two sides of the same coin.
That's what I wanted to talk about, right? Like, because exactly like the currently ArcGIS has this kind of duality, or like it kind of have hard time deciding on which side it's leaning, and kind of be everything to everyone, which is always a tricky, right, line to walk. So, I mean, personally, I love that this is more on the event side, right? Like, but that kind of leads me to two things that, how could we kind of like look at those patterns where essentially, like, let's say events happen, but at some point in time, I want to feed them to state, right? Like, what are the patterns there? Like, do I just subscribe? Which is fine. Like, it would cause probably outreach in some, purist circles, but like kind of how can we, should we, and if so, like is there should we kind of look at this proposal as the total isolation, just like something to process events, or do we kind of want to fit into the bigger architecture, right? Like what I guess is for me the other way of asking a question, when you were like, what's the main motivation, right? Like, what are the kind of killer use cases? How you envision this to be used?
native observables.
Yeah. What is the kind of, like a bigger story around it?
Bigger story. I mean, yeah, it's the main it's no. I mean, things where callbacks are clunky on the web are opportunities where observables could be useful. So the big one where we see a lot of ergonomic issues when it comes to nested event listeners and deeply nested callbacks is event listening. It's no coincidence that the main, like the only observable returning native API in our proposal is on event target, because the main use cases with event handling and solving the whole like callback hell problem with that event targets have that we can't solve with promises. Promises have like asynchronous scheduling, so they don't work with all events, and they're one shot instead of multi-shot. So
promises are like more on the value side, right?
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
With
so-
the time component, right?
Mhm.
But we've thought about some integration points with like mutation observer and resize observer and other things that have observers and that might give you an opportunity to filter through values, but you're passing in a callback, and so like there could be some integration points with that, but I think that's the main story so far.
Like stream APIs as well, with like fetch that streams responses and stuff. Yeah.
Yep. And the other thing that's interesting is like we have the from operator, which is, you literally call it, it's a static method, it's observable.from, and you pass it in either a promise, a synchronous iterator like an array, iterable, an async iterable, or an observable, and it'll convert any of those things to an observable. So you could pass in an async generator function, or you could pass in a promise, you could pass in all kinds of things to the observable.from and get an observable from it. So that's just something.
Can you pass in a signal?
Not now.
Can you build that for us, Dom?
I'll do it tonight. I'll do it right now.
How does from know what it can convert, right? Like,
Sorry, how does what?
how does from know what set of things it can convert? Is there like a well-known symbol that describes the conversion to observable, or?
It's not quite. So we basically type check on the object passed in, like if it's a promise, or if it implements symbol.iterable or symbol.async iterator, or iterate, is it symbol.iterator or iterable, whatever the one is.
Yeah.
The synchronous and the asynchronous version. So we type check based off of implementation of those symbols, or just like actual types between like promise and observable native objects.
Okay.
So like we could add, I don't know enough about signals to know how this would look, but like that's, I would love to figure out the integration story between observables and signals. It's hard when I
We
don't
could
know.
call it resource.
Yeah, so signals, they don't have a time component.
Right.
You cannot actually observe a signal changing. What you can observe is some system outside of the signals that tell you like now is a good time to call them, which is what we call effects, right? Like when a signal changes, then something gets scheduled in a system that says like the graph is consistent. Here's your new value.
Yeah.
Go forth and have fun. And so you could build essentially like the to observable operator for native observables. That would be your from signal. So it would have to be tied to some system that knows how to create effects.
But that's tricky, right? Like because DC39 even like it's not going there, so
Yeah.
So it's
you could define microtask. Right? Like
or like like you need an almighty ticker, right? Like that says like okay, now it's a good time.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
We want all of it.
So
almighty especially. Right?
So Alex, would the resource, because you were talking with us just recently about this new resource, which to me, I kind of look at it as like an adapter, right?
If signals if observables are in the browser,
like
our
would
resource,
that, well,
our
he's
resource
talking
loader
about
would
types.
happily take an observable.
Yeah. So is that helpful for like having things going back and forth like that? That's going to make it easier for all of us then.
Yeah.
And then would it be helpful, because he was saying it's going to do type checking. Can we include the resource type in the browser? Is that crazy?
I think it's more the other way around. Like resource is an angular thing
Okay.
of like how you define, like how an application can tell Angular that it's waiting on something asynchronous. and what state that fetches in. So the resource kind of transitions from like, you know, I have nothing to do to like, I have a request that's pending to like, I got a response or I got an error. And then it communicates that state to the framework in signals in a way where Angular can then like decide kind of what to show. But the resource today works on a loader, and the loader function returns a promise. So it's an, you know, do a fetch, wait for that to resolve, get a value back. And that's great, but there are some kinds of requests where you want to have multiple values. And so I have a prototype of resource actually that is using async iterable under the hood instead of promise to be able to get multiple values back. But async iterables are not the easiest things to write. You write them with async generators, and like that, you know, I have to go to MDN and look at how to do that every time I try to write one. So observable seems like a kind of a more natural thing there. And that kind of like hints at another topic I think you asked about, Dominic, which is the abort signal. And I think on our end, like abort signal is the way to go as far as cancellation, because it is at least the best chance we have on the web of having a cohesive story across more than one API of how to abort things.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think for simple examples, it feels clunky because it's like, oh, I have to create this controller before the observable and then pass in the signal and pass
not the most for sure.
Yeah, and so the reason for that is like, you know, if the observable synchronously produces values while you're subscribing to it, like in the middle of the subscribe call, you don't have a way of aborting your subscription unless you have a controller that was established before the subscription. And so like, but that's not a really common case. And so the idea is maybe we could have the unsubscribe function that like works in all the cases except for the one where, you know, your observable synchronously spit out a bunch of values. And maybe we could have both. But anyways, I'm also agreed in agreement with the abort controller being standard way. It seems fine. Like,
so I think like this kind of leads us to two interesting conversations. One is like, and this is just like pure API design, so like just I'll throw it out there, but like cancel was kind of like abort controller was like cancellation was like almost felt like, oh, I want to cancel, like kill the producer, kind of like translating it to like, oh, it's kind of, I'm kind of backing off from listening. It's kind of a slightly mind twisting, but like again, like this is API design. The second, I guess, we are thinking about the same, which is like
Well, I wanted to mention one thing too, which is you know, abort controller looks really clunky in examples because you're kind of showing the full spectrum of like making the abort controller, passing the signal through, like doing the cancellation, subscribing to the abort, you know, event, which would be funny to subscribe with an observable because it's technically event target. But the like we have this kind of like rule of thumb in Angular and in most frameworks that use RxJS, right? Like you don't ever subscribe manually, or you try very hard to avoid this and you let the framework do it for you. And so in most cases, you as a user won't feel the abort controller overhead, you know, boilerplate because the framework is bringing the abort controller. That's what resource does. It, you know, it makes an abort controller under the hood, and like you get the abort signal as long as you plumb that through to whatever you're doing on the back end. It's fine. And so it's actually really ideal for the observable spec because you give us an observable in resource, a standard one, we will subscribe with our abort signal. And then the user doesn't even have to think about cancellation, right? It's kind of the same promise of RxJS, which is not as convenient with promises because the abort controller kind of has to be plumbed through there.
Yeah, it makes sense.
Kind of on just tangential, I think what Pavel was thinking about there too, are there plans to integrate standard observable with for await and async iterable? Like, will it be an async iterable?
That's a good question. There's an issue filed about this, and I think the concern was we would have to like, what's the queuing strategy? Like if it starts emitting a bunch of values before you subscribe, does the observable just hold on to them forever, or do we let the user pass in some sort of queuing strategy signal to say like, oh, drop values until I subscribe, or actually no, queue them all on an unbounded way. So I think initially, like right off the bat, probably not, just because I don't think it's a blocker for the API to ship, and we haven't decided on that yet. I think Ben is interested in doing that though. Like RxJS, I believe he made RxJS observables async iterable, and I'm pretty sympathetic to doing that in the platform, but I want to make sure I understand the ramifications of doing that in the native API before just doing it.
Yeah, like adding a queuing behavior right from the user is almost like a manual conversion to async iterable, with like you pass some behavior in at that point.
Yeah.
One of the challenges that we saw with, I tried to play with Ben's implementation, using it through a streaming resource through the async iterable interface, and the problem that comes up is for await has no ability to pass an abort signal into the subscription that it makes, which makes the abort case like quite there's an edge case where like you're still stuck waiting on a promise until something actually resolves.
Yeah, that makes sense. I don't know if this impacts that case a whole lot, but like we actually hope that the abort controller won't need to be used a lot, because we have a few terminating operators like take until and the things like I think first or once or whatever, some things that basically specify that this observable stream should be torn down like on its own.
Yeah.
Like one quick example I'll just share really fast is this one, right? This is like a really simple toy example where this gives you an unbounded stream, like a lazy unbounded stream of mouse move events, and we want to take all of them until this unbounded stream of mouse up events fires its first one. And this is like a self-terminating set, like an observable that listens to two events: first mouse move and then mouse up. And both of them tear themselves down and get unsubscribed to without you ever having to actually call abort or do anything like that, because take until knows how to tear things down itself. And so I don't know, I'm hoping like that kind of pattern can be useful enough to where whatever issues abort controller passing a signal in to observables will kind of be mitigated with the self-terminating streams. But so I don't know if that totally relates to like the 408 case, but I think it's interesting to think about.
Yeah, I think the observables that we deal with are more like one-off data fetches, right? Like fire an HTTP request and it's going to come back at some point. Maybe it returns multiple values because you're streaming responses, but you have some higher logic that's like, the component got destroyed, so like cancel everything that's currently pending.
Yeah.
Gotcha. Yeah. But I think like the take until is a good call out, because we could, if it were standard, we could wrap that at least.
Yeah. Good.
The question about
to say Lars.
Yeah.
I know Lars has thoughts.
I waited for a pause so I can jump in. When I see the take until, is it possible to merge observables, like the merge operator or merge creation function from RxJS? So I can pass two observables to the take until.
Okay. And what? Okay. So I don't actually know what merge does. I can try and visualize it in my head.
Merge subscribes to multiple observables and merges the values into one stream. So I have one observable with the values from multiple streams. The use case may be that I pass in some cancellation in the take until, like the mouse up, and additionally something like the take until destroyed from Angular. So the subscription gets cancelled when the component gets destroyed.
Okay, I see. So take until does not take in multiple observables. I feel like you could make an observable that subscribes to an underlying set of many observables and then just pass that one into take until. I mean, as like a user land way around that. Although, but it could be also worth like making take until take more, but it does not have like that kind of merge semantics right now.
Yeah.
That's an interesting point. I like that's good feedback.
Lars always has good questions. And Dominic, speaking of good questions.
Yeah, I was just wondering. So in RxJS, we have like the pipe, right? Like the pipe function, which takes in the operators to the observable operators, right? And so the way you use an RxJS observable, it looks very different from now the native ones.
Mhm.
And I wonder, like, if I want to write a custom operator, how should I do that? Should you override the prototype, or like, do you write a function that takes in the whole observable, but that would then not be so declarative, right? Because you kind of have to wrap it, the source, instead of
Yeah.
having like this list of what will happen.
Right. I think the most natural way to do that would be tack it onto the prototype. I've seen that kind of pattern with promises a bit with operators that native promises did not have initially. So I think that's the way I envision it. Ben would know more. Maybe Alex has a comment.
Yeah, I've chatted with Ben a little bit about this, and because he's not here, I can quote him as saying anything I want, and he has to go with it. I think the plan, or like what he talked to me was, he was imagining having an like Rx function that would take kind of the observable and the operators and kind of act like the pipe on the outside, but that it would align with the pipelining spec that was also on standards track. And so that it would be set up so that once pipelining lands in the language, that you kind of have the ability to use a standard observable with the Rx function, just taking the operators.
Okay.
Like observable pipeline to Rx of some set of sequences.
But
So it was trying to leverage additional standards coming down the pipe to make that really ergonomic.
so if now someone else develops like an observable library like RxJS, then if we depend on the RxJS implementation of a pipe, then this new or other like observable library, it would not be compatible, right? So if there's like no unified way of piping,
I think you would need to use some mechanism to chain them together, possibly the pipelining spec. I don't know enough to know whether that, how ergonomic that would be.
also the pipelining spec comes to the native observables.
It's a TC39 proposal.
Oh, okay.
Yes.
Oh, sorry, I didn't know about that.
So it's a little bit detached from observables. Oh, I think you're muted, Bonnie.
Okay, this is the nice thing about this group, because I didn't know about it either. And so we're allowed to say, Alex, can you back up and explain that? What, like we're 5, please.
Oh gosh. Yeah, at this point I have to like stop quoting Ben and actually start speculating.
No. See, this is the thing, because we invited Ben and he didn't show up. So Dominic is going to go tell him Bonnie roasted him and Alex made up quotes from him. And that's what he gets for not showing up. That's allowed. It's okay.
Yeah.
But okay, so basically if we have this new observable API that we're so excited about and we want pipes.
Yeah. So I like one potential future of the world, right, is you import Rx from RxJS. And let's say you have your native observable, so like, button dot when click, right? Like you have this. So today you would kind of have to do Rx of click, and then my like custom op1, custom op2, in order to kind of this would be the equivalent of like click.pipe, right, before. And I think the plan was to have, in the pipelining version of things, you have like the pipelining operator of custom op1, custom op2. I don't know if it's exactly the syntax, but something like this, that where the pipeline knows that like Rx applies to click and can pipe a bunch of operators to it. And then if you had some other library that was also providing helpers, that you would have like, you know, Lodash, observable, blah, right? That was at least at some point a vague sketch of the plan, as I understood it.
That's very interesting because I have not seen that. So that's good to know.
Yeah.
I hadn't seen that either. Thank you, Alex. So this, I saw little Dan was working on that. And is that also Ben Lesh is working on that too? We knew about the signals proposal for TC39, but I didn't know about the pipeline one.
It's been around for a while. It's kind of stalled out. As
We're
many,
gonna go get little Dan.
as many standards do
We'll
for
try.
years, right? I think there were like two competing ideas of how to implement it, and like they couldn't come to a decision. So it's a bit in limbo. But we're also interested in it because we have pipes in Angular, and it would be nice if that was part of the language. Yeah.
We got to do it for Dominic.
Yeah.
Dominic Farolino and Dominic Bachman. We'll go get little Dan and we'll ask him. At least he can give us an update on what's going on with that, and we can tell him that this would be really helpful for everyone, for Alex Rickabaugh and for Dominic, and all of us would just love it.
Honestly, that kind of stuff works though. Like reaching out to people and basically saying like, hey, we have a small army of developers that are really interested in this. That does help move things along sometimes. So
put me in, coach.
I think we're kind of getting to the point where we have to drop off.
it was great to talk to you guys. Thanks for joining.
Yeah, and let's sync up more, because I think we have quite a few topics to kind of dive into.
And I would love, for example, just kind of chat more about this, like how we reduce those events to state and signals, and like, you know, but there are for sure more topics than this.
We could use a lot more discussion. I'm very interested in having that because that's something I'm not as familiar with, and something that I think the platform should kind of have a good explanation for where these things really hit. So
we'll go get little Dan. We'll go get Ben Lesh. We'll be back next Friday.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so
guys.
much.
Have a good evening.
Cheers.
Bye.
Cheers.
Bye.
Bye.